Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classics from volume number 8, the 9 Greek dramas. We are now to the very last one. This one is Aristophanes The Frogs. This is our classic example of what we call often, and scholars have called, old comedy. So go ahead and put that in your notes. I'm going to let you do a lot of research on your own about this term. But old comedy as opposed to new comedy. And again, I'll let you do that research. Aristophanes is the classic example of this. Unfortunately, unfortunately, this is the only comic writer that we know of. We know that there were whole bunches of them in Athens. This is the only one that we know about, and that in and of itself is, in fact, quite tragic for us. He is, Aristophanes, the great satirists. And in fact, I'm going to make this argument at the end of this lecture that you can draw a clear line between Aristophanes and Chaucer, who we've given lots and lots of lectures on, and in fact, on LearnStrong.net you can find several lectures on Chaucer, and I'll come back to comments that I've made. And from Chaucer to Pope and Swift, who I've given a lot of lectures on as well, to finally writers in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, in the early 21st century, Beckett in the 20th century, Tom Stoppard, for example, in the late 20th century and even today. And then you can even think about the great Monty Python. The Holy Grail will come to mind in 303. It's a classic text for us. And even, we might say, the political satire of Saturday Night Live, and the fact that still Saturday Night Live continues to have some resonance for viewers of that text. So all of that really does trace back to the great writer Aristophanes. Now we're going to be making the argument, and I've made it elsewhere on LearnStrong, when I've talked about Chaucer, when I've talked about Swift and Pope, that comedy at its core is often quite conservative or reformist in its orientation, right? And I've said this elsewhere, if it's great comedy, it's not just funny and entertaining. There's something else going on right beneath the surface. So for example, Chaucer is doing more than just simply making us laugh in The Wife of Bath. He is attacking the patriarchy, and you can go back and take a look at those lectures at LearnStrong.net. Now speaking of LearnStrong.net, this is lecture number 68. But I do recommend that you go and look, if you haven't done it, look at lecture number 59. That is to say, the Intro to Greek Drama, and more particularly there I talk about tragedy. In lectures 60 through 63 I do Aeschylus. This is significant because these writers are going to factor into our text, the frogs. And then lecture 64 to 65, we're doing Sophocles there with Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, and Antigone. And then finally 66 through 67, we did our Euripides, finishing with lecture 67 and that classic, the Bacchae texts of Euripides. All three of these writers, by the way, are going to factor heavily in this play, which is why I think that Dr. Eliot chose this play instead of The Clouds, which is traditionally the text that one studies when one is introduced to Aristophanes. The Clouds is the text where Aristophanes makes fun and ridicules Socrates. We mentioned this text in our Harvard Classics lecture earlier when we were talking about Plato's Apology, and Socrates, in his defense, in fact, doesn't directly name Aristophanes, but does in fact make references to the fact that the reason I'm on trial here in front of you people is because there's this comic poet who made fun of me in one of his plays, and the people of Athens then have a certain kind of view of me which is not completely legitimate. Well, let's go ahead now and just remind you that when we are talking in 303, we're always messing around with our learning theory, that is to say our ability or our desire to connect new information to old information. And we do that in our reading through our 3 levels of reading. We'll answer 3 questions. What does the text say? Level 1. What does the text mean? Level 2. Here we subdivide 2A, themes, messages. 2B, rhetoric. Not what is said by, for example, Aristophanes, but how he says it. Now, in our previous lectures, we were concentrating on symbol and conflict. We'll play that game again here, but we also want to pay attention to the ways in which both symbolism and conflict in Aristophanes' play leads to satire. Of course, irony has been a pivotal part of so much of what we said. But here, satire and the satiric approach, right? In other words, we say one thing, we mean something else, or we're in fact making fun of, in some ways, mocking, right? But let's say this. We said this in our study, for example, of Pope's The Rape of the Lock, that mock epic. It's only funny, the mock, the satire, the funny. It's only funny if you know the original, right? And, for example, to appreciate the frogs, there is an assumption on the part of Aristophanes, which would be legitimate for his Greek audience, that you know all the plays of the three great traditions, starting with Aeschylus, and then Sophocles, and then finally Euripides. The big three, as we sometimes will call them. Now, let's go ahead and put this in our notes. Aristophanes in his plays almost always has an agenda. There are, in fact, people who argue that Aristophanes was the greatest writer of all time. Now, of course, that's a silly argument, and we made the same point when we were talking about Milton or Shakespeare. People want to say the greatest writer of all time, etc., etc. But if you were to say that being a great writer means that you have a tremendous legacy, that people follow you, even though they don't know that they're following you, Aristophanes for sure stands right there at the front of the class. There's no question. Who was this guy? Well, he was true genius. And pretty much any time you pick up any kind of biography information of Aristophanes, a couple of things really quickly are said. One, really important writer. Two, we know very, very little about him. We infer information from his text, but that's sometimes kind of dangerous to do. His dates, 446 to 386. We only have 11 of his some 40 plays, and that is really sad. I mean, if there's anything I've hoped, and I've said this throughout all of my Harvard Classics lectures, I hope that if there's anything that happens through these lectures, is that you're interested in going and finding more texts and reading, and I hope that's the case in your study of Aristophanes, as I've hoped it's the case of your study of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides as well. He represents old comedy. Again, I'm going to let you do your own research on this. It has a lot to do with not only subject matter, but the way that the actual plays are constructed. The comedies will look something like the tragedies, the use of the chorus and that kind of thing. But you could argue that there's a science to the comedies that's really important, and I'll again let you do your own research there. He is considered the father, or sometimes even the prince of old comedy or comedy in general. Like what we've said about Alexander Pope, he greatly feared, greatly respected. You didn't want to end up on his radar. I think of Heracleon or any number of other important personages, political personages. Think, for example, today of the way in which if you are a politician and you end up being somehow made fun of on Saturday Night Live, this can actually damage your credibility sometimes, right? Depending on who the politician is or the like. Some people, for example, argued a number of years ago that President Barack Obama was able to win the presidency because of the help of Saturday Night Live. Not so much for him, but rather making fun of some of the people who are running against him. Certainly Aristophanes is in that same tradition. He loves to ridicule politicians of his day, and we're told that he left audiences just side-splitting because he could gut politicians and any number of other celebrities, we might say, today. Again, very little is known about him, but we do infer through his texts, and we're going to see this even in this text here, that he was a conservative in his political views, and he hated what we call the sophists. Now, of course, go back to earlier lectures of the Harvard Classics when I was talking about Plato, and especially the Apology. Socrates is actually being accused of being a sophist, although he himself said he was not, because of a text called The Clouds that unfortunately is not in this volume, and I'm not going to lecture it in detail, but in that text, Socrates is ridiculed and made fun of as a sophist. Of course, Socrates himself loathed the sophists and said he was not a sophist, right? Some think, however, that actually Aristophanes was a pal of Plato's, and Socrates is purported to have stood up during the Clouds so that, in fact, people could not just make fun of the character who was, kind of representing Socrates, but he said you can even make fun of Here I Am. Now, whether that story is true or not, again, we don't have a lot of knowledge. He was, Aristophanes, possibly a pacifist, and possibly an atheist. Now, by atheist here, we simply mean that he's ready to ridicule the gods in profound ways. We're going to see this after your study of Euripides the Bacchae. when we look at this play, The Frogs, and we look at Dionysius, who is the clear center stage in this play, we're going to see a different kind of Dionysius than obviously Euripides, right? Kind of like a political cartoonist today. I mentioned Saturday Night Live. Kind of like maybe Monty Python's. Of course, a really important text in here that we've commented on is the search for the Holy Grail. The thing about, though, those texts is, it's not funny unless you know the original, right? So, for example, on Saturday Night Live a number of years ago, there was an actress who was able to portray Sarah Palin, for example, and she, of course, kind of exaggerated some of her mannerisms or whatever. But here's the thing. It's not really that funny unless you know the original. So, for example, if you have an actor on Saturday Night Live making fun of the president, for example, it's only funny if you know what the president's mannerisms are like, or what that president kind of stands for, or represents, or whatever. The same is true with Aristophanes, and that's tragic because so much of what he makes fun of, especially in his political satire, a lot of times we just don't know a lot about what was specifically going on, and so a lot of times it's lost on us. And it's certainly, let me just say this for your notes, it's certainly lost in translation. If the tragedies are hard to translate out of the Greek and into English, the Greek of Aristophanes is really difficult because of the satiric wit. It's really hard often to find specifically the right kinds of language to use to represent the types of satire, right? Again, Aristotle will have written his great treatise, the Poetics, on tragedy. We believe or know that he did actually write a second part to that text that treated comedy. Unfortunately, scholars will often say it was lost in the Alexandrian fire, but the last extant copy apparently was gone. But we think that probably we know that Aristotle believed that tragedy was way more important than comedy as a form of art. Think about, for example, our Academy Awards. If you look at all the winners of Academy Award Best Film, and you look at all the ones that were in fact, kind of nominated for best film, it's fascinating how few of those are actually outright comedies. Most of those are dramas, which of course are going to be kind of like the tragedies that we've been studying. Why is there such an emphasis on the drama versus the comic? It goes back to probably Aristotle, and this idea is for us today maybe starting to change a little bit, because we are a culture that really, I think, we're in some ways probably sophisticated enough, if I can say it that way, to really appreciate true comedy. And certainly all of that is a tribute to Aristophanes, right? There was an argument that Aristotle made, though, that you go through a cathartic process when you're watching, for example, Oedipus get jacked, or Pentheus get jacked in the Bacchae or whatever. And you could probably reason that laughter is also purgative or cathartic. And we need to laugh as much as we need to cry, if you will, if you get my drift, all right? All right, let's work through now the very basic storyline. It is humorous from the start. It gets kind of pretty serious by the end, and I'll help you to get through that. Again, let me say that my hope is that you've read this play on your own, and you're coming to my lecture to just try and help you, understand the play better. Of course, you don't have to take that route if you want to just listen to what I have to say, and maybe this then will motivate you to study the play on your own. I hope that that's the case. We begin with the god Dionysius, okay? But hey, this is not the god Dionysius that we recognize right from the beginning of the Bacchae, and certainly by the end, where he's got, for example, women tearing apart, a mother tearing apart her own son and bringing his head on stage. Woo, woo, that's heavy stuff. The Dionysius of this play, completely different, especially at the start. He has a goal. He is wanting to go to Hades, and there in Hades he wants to find the great poet, writer, Euripides, who has just passed away, and he wants to bring him back to Athens. Now, we're going to find out at the end of this play, none of this is actually really what Dionysius is ultimately wanting to do. Certainly not for Aristophanes. It's going to come down to a debate in Hades about who is the more important poet. Aeschylus, the first of the great tragic writers, and we saw his Oresteia as a classic example, or his Prometheus Bound as a classic example, or Euripides, who has just passed, and Euripides is going to represent a different kind of tragedy, far more degenerate in Aristophanes' view, as we'll get into it. Dionysius is not alone. He's with his slave Xanthias. Xanthias kind of represents all slaves, and Xanthias, think here of kind of Sancho Panza in Don Quixote's class, in the classic Don Quixote text of Cervantes. He's the sidekick, but he's actually way more intelligent than Dionysius. Dionysius is dressed up, for example, like Hercules, because he wants to go into the underworld, and he knows Hercules did it once. In Hades, he's going to bring Euripides back from the dead, who had died in 406. We're watching this play a year later in 405, the same year that after he had died, Euripides' play, the Bacchae, would be presented and performed. Let's just put it in your notes just to remind, we're 5 years in 405. We're 5 years roughly away from the death of Socrates. That's a different kind of tragedy, and many people argue that it was Aristophanes who set up Socrates to be set on trail by Miletus and those other guys. Again, I've given lectures on that in the Harvard Classics and elsewhere on LearnStrong.net. Why does he need to bring Euripides back to Athens? Because all the great writers are dead, right? Once he's in Hades, this contest is going to occur, and that's really going to be the heart of the play, so write that down. This is a play about texts and about poets and about the value of poets. And the question, who is the greatest playwright of them all? Well, you get a contest between the great Aeschylus, who's going to represent the old school, and and Euripides, who's going to represent the more new, and for Aristophanes, the more degenerate school. In the end, he's going to choose Aeschylus. The older, more conservative is better. So that's kind of an overview of the text. Now, let's go ahead and go to the text itself at level 1. We're going to do this briefly. It is unfortunate. I wish that I could work in more detail with you. We just don't have the time. But let's go ahead and go through it. We begin with Dionysius. Really, we actually begin the play with a debate between Dionysius and his slave, and they're back and forth. Who is, how am I going to figure out a way to tell the right jokes and that kind of thing. The whole play begins then with kind of comedy. From the very beginning, Dionysius, he's dressed up like Hercules. Okay, he's got his lion hide and his club on. Go back to my lectures on Hercules and Edith Hamilton's mythology to know the serious side of Hercules. You'll remember Hercules is this kind of scary hero type who, when he gets mad, for example, he can kill his own children, or he can kill, for example, a servant boy or whatever. He's got this tremendous anger, rage problem. This is a different Hercules that we're going to meet here. Here, we're going to meet Dionysius. He's going to visit with Hercules, obviously the half-brother, right? You know that one. And he asks him the question, by the way, when Hercules sees Dionysius dressed up like himself, he just starts dying laughing. Why? Because Dionysius is this effeminate looking, you love to spend time drinking and that kind of thing. Not this big, strong, burly, let's go out and fight and kill things. And yet that's how he's dressed up. And Hercules is like, dude, why are you dressed up like this? And Dionysius says, I need your help. Here's the thing. I want to go to Hades. I want to go to hell. What's the best way to get there? I know that you went there and you stole that three-headed dog service as one of your great challenges. So I want to know. You tell me how to get there. And right away, Hercules will say, well, I'll tell you the fastest way to get to hell. Hang yourself, or you could drink poison, hemlock. Note the irony. In 5 years, we're gonna have Socrates actually drinking hemlock, right? Or you can jump off of a tower. You take your pick. Well, the ironies, of course, abound. Gods can't die. Of course, this is Dionysius. He's a god. If he wants to, all he has to do is go into the underworld. And of course, here we're playing all kinds of games with motifs. Think about this one. So, for example, everybody in the house in 405, immediately when they hear about, oh, somebody's going to take a journey into hell, they actually don't think of Hercules first. Who do they think of? You're right, Odysseus. Of course, Odysseus will take his journey into the underworld, right? Okay, in the Odyssey, right? And we'll have that game being played. Of course, we've got as well, think about it, Aeneas will have this same kind of journey later in the Roman Virgil's poem, the Aeneid. Even later, we're going to have, of course, Dante taking his journey into the underworld, right? And so this notion of taking a journey into the underworld, it's kind of like one of those special name tags that you put on an epic hero. Dionysius is going to take his journey into the underworld, right? So we are playing with the hero's quest, only we're doing it in sarcastic ways, in satiric ways. Hercules tells him, you really, Xanthias will echo these sentiments later, you really don't want to go down there. It's a nasty place, just stay away, you don't want to go there. No, I gotta go. I need to bring Euripides back. Athens needs him. There's all kinds of dripping satire here. Athens needs him because we are in a bad way and we need the great Euripides back. So I'm going down, I'm going to get Euripides, I'm going to bring it back. We immediately think of Orpheus, of course, and Eurydice and the whole story of how Orpheus goes down to try and find his girl and bring her back. All of those storylines are playing out in the minds of an audience here, right? Well, down at the lake that he's told to go to, possibly Acheron, down there at the lake, he's going to meet Charon, who's going to ferry him across. Several things happen right away. Charon says, okay, I will take you, and he points to Dionysius, but he says, your slave, don't take slaves, he's got to walk. Well, you can see the ironies here abounding, because Xanthias, through this whole text, Xanthias is actually the intelligent one, and Dionysius is kind of like a buffoon, especially at the beginning of this play. So Xanthias has to take his walk. Dionysius gets in the boat to get rowed across the river by Charon, and immediately he's told, you got to row. And Dionysius is like, what are you talking about, row? I don't row. I don't like to row. No. In other words, no work. All he likes to do is get drunk and party and that kind of thing. And Charon's like, hey, dude, you got to row. Start rowing. And so you've got Dionysius. Notice how this is such a different view of the god than, for example, in Euripides' Bacchae, that was so serious and heavy. Now you've got Dionysius, and he's actually rowing across the lake of hell. And of course, he's tiring, and he doesn't like it. And at the same time, we will have the great Song of the Frogs. Now, this is the only mention of frogs in the entire text, and yet I think that there is something subtle going on here. Because what Aristophanes is going to do is he's going to say, the song of the frogs, the croaking of the frogs, the translation out of the Greek is something kind of like this. Berkex, 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 coax, coax, berkex, 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 coax, coax. And in fact, sororities of any number of kinds, you can do your own research on this, have played the game of this song. It becomes kind of the famous song of this play.